In this video, we're going to be introducing the concept of an argumentative fallacy. In simple terms, the easiest explanation I can give of the word fallacy is that a fallacy is a mistake. If an argument commits a fallacy, then it's a bad argument. It has done something wrong. And there are some very common errors or mistakes that people make in their reasoning that are so common that philosophers have given them names. In the textbook, they discuss 22 types of fallacy, in fact even more since some of those types have further subtypes. But there are two main broad categories of fallacies that we can think about when we are trying to categorize types of mistakes that an argument might make. One kind of fallacy is called a formal fallacy. Remember that a formal fallacy is called formal because it concerns the argument's form. On the other hand, an informal fallacy concerns the content of an argument rather than its form. So when we're looking at formal fallacies, we can determine that they commit a fallacy by looking at the structure alone. We don't even need to know what the premises and the conclusion are. If we just know the structure of the premises and the conclusion, then we would be able to determine that it commits a formal fallacy. So here's an example. The structure: all A's are B's, all C's are B's, so therefore all A's are C's. This is not a valid argument, and so we can say that it commits a formal fallacy. It commits a mistake, and we can discern that mistake by looking at the form alone. In order to discern the mistake that occurs in an informal fallacy, it won't be enough to look at the form of the argument. We're going to have to look at the actual content of the argument and what's being said in order to show why it commits a fallacy if the fallacy is informal. So, informal fallacies are fallacious due to their content rather than their form. So just remember, formal, form, informal, something other than form for, to be specific, content. So to test whether you understand the concept of a fallacy and to just kind of explain one notion, consider this question: true or false? If an argument commits a fallacy, therefore its conclusion must be false. So if an argument makes an error, makes a mistake, and has bad reasoning, do you think that means that the conclusion is always false? Take a second to think about it. Is it possible for an argument to commit a fallacy and still have a true conclusion, or does committing a fallacy automatically mean that the conclusion is false? Well, this statement is false. All it means if an argument commits a fallacy, it does mean that it's a bad argument, but bad arguments can have true conclusions. So if we can show that an argument commits a fallacy, that doesn't automatically prove that the conclusion of that argument is false. I think this is important to point out, especially because as you're working through the textbook, there might be a lot of examples and you might think, hey, maybe you agree with the conclusion in one of the arguments that the textbook is saying is fallacious. Now, again, this doesn't mean that the textbook is trying to argue that that conclusion is not true. You would need a separate argument for that claim. Instead, it's just that particular argument for that conclusion is a bad one. All right, so like I mentioned, there are 22 informal fallacies discussed in the textbook, divided up into 5 categories. I'll make a separate video to overview those. This was just to introduce you to the main idea of a fallacy in general. So there you have it. What's a fallacy? A fallacy is a mistake. A fallacy is when an argument makes an error, and these errors are so common that we've categorized them and given them names. We discussed formal and informal fallacies, and in the next video we will talk about 22 types of informal fallacies that are discussed in our textbook.